In the name of God, hello everybody. This is session 8 of your morphology lesson. As you know, in the previous session, I talked about the relationship between morphology and phonology and the allomorphs which produced by some phenomena like assimilation and epenthesis. Then I talked about some approaches and in the morphology. One of them is phonotactic constraints, the other pattern is root and pattern morphology, and the third one is reduplication, which I want to talk about it in this session. So what is reduplication? In reduplication, a continuous substring from either the beginning or the end of word is copied. Languages may use reduplication for inflection or derivation. You know the definition of inflection and derivation, which I talked about it in the previous sessions. So plural reduplication in languages of some dialects in Philippines illustrated below. The reduplicated portion of the word is in italics, as you see in this example. For example, calding, so we have calding. So as you see here, we have we copied some part of the word and we put it in the first part of the word, calding. Pusa, for example, it meaning is cat. Pusa, it means cats. Classe and classe, you see here, we call it reduplication. So the inclusion of borrowings in the data set above shows that reduplication is a productive means of forming plurals in this language, Ilocano So reduplication bears an important similarity to root and pattern morphology. You see in root and pattern morphology in some Semitic languages like Hebrew and Arabic, we use 3 consonants as a base form. Then we superimpose vowels on this pattern to produce some words. So this is the reduplication again have some similarity. Reduplication has some similarity to root and pattern morphology. So the replicant typically must follow a certain pattern or adhere to some other prosodic requirement. In Ilocano plurals, as you see in this Philippines language, as you can see, the reduplicant is always of the shape, for example, CVC or CVV. You see here, CVC, again CVC, CCVC. You see here, there is a kind of pattern here in reduplication like Rutan pattern morphology. So there are some similarities between these two kind of approaches in morphology. So this is the third part of these approaches, reduplication, and as you see, we reduplicate some parts of the word and put it in the beginning or end of the word. We copied some part of the word to produce some other meanings, for example plural here in this language. And you see there are some similarities between this approach and the other approaches in morphology. So this is reduplication. The other part of this chapter which I want to talk about it is about primary and secondary affixes. What is primary affixes and what is secondary affixes? Over the years, our knowledge of morphological structure has been enhanced by work in phonology. We learn a lot by observing the phonological processes that take place or do not take place within particular sets of morphologically complex words. One distinction that has come out of work that pairs morphology and phonology is between primary and secondary affixes, also known as level 1 and level 2 affixes, you see here, or class 1 and class 2 affixes. In English, this distinction is intimately connected with language history. Primary affixes in English are often of Latin Romance origin, while secondary affixes are often of native Germanic origin. This is the first difference between, the primary and the secondary affixes. However, we de-emphasize this fact in the following discussion because etymology can only take us so far in morphological analysis. The primary-secondary distinction is a living process, regardless of its history, and in English, as in other languages of the world, it cannot be explained away as etymological residue. Below, we are some, you see here, example from Kiparsky, 1983, of words bearing ian, a primary affix 11, and was bearing ism, a secondary affix, in example number 12. You see here Mendel, Mendelian, Mongol, Mongolian, Parkinson, Parkinsonian, Shakespeare, Shakespearean, grammar, grammarian. You see here, this ian is a kind of primary affix, and I talked about the properties of this kind of primary affix and the differences between the primary affixes and secondary affixes in the 12 example. Mendel, Mendelism, Mongol, Mongolism, Parkinson, Parkinson, Parkinsonism, national, nationalism, capital, capitalism. You see here in this example, if you read the words in 11 and 12 to yourself, you hear an important difference. Words with ian, the first examples, which is a primary affix ian, have a stress shift. Mendel in the first, the stress in Mendel is on the first syllable, while in Mendelian it is on the second, as you see. So likewise, Parkinson is a stress on the first syllable, you see, but Parkinsonian is stress on the third. We can generalize by saying that in all words with ian, the primary affix, the stress is on the syllable that immediately precedes the suffix. A stem suffix with ism on the other hand in this example are stressed on the same syllable as their on affix counterpart. For example, we have national is a stress on the first syllable, just like and nationalism again is a stress on the first syllable, like the national. This is the first and most famous difference between primary and secondary affixes in English. Primary affixes cause a stress shift, while secondary affixes do not. This is the main and the first difference between these two kind of affixes, which if I ask you about these differences, you should talk about these examples and this property. If primary and secondary affixes both occur in the same word, we can make a second prediction. The primary affix will occur closer to the stem than the secondary affix. Therefore, Parkinsonianism is a possible word, but Parkinsonismian is not. It's ungrammatical. So we should use the primary affix near the stem, then the secondary affix, and not vice versa. So now consider the word reparable and repairable. You see these two examples. Both have repair as their stem, as you see, but it is slightly disguised in the first. Semantically, both mean capable of being repaired, but only the second would be used to describe a broken appliance. Repairable has the additional sense of liable to be paid back or recovered, as with reparable damages. These words show that the suffix able in English is actually two suffixes. One is primary, as in repairable, and the other is secondary, as in repairable. Traditional usage among morphologists is to use the symbol, this kind of symbol you see here, to mark the juncture between a stem and a primary affix, and to use this mark, this one, this sign, to mark the juncture between a stem and a secondary affix. We use these symbols to differentiate between the two types of able here. Other word pairs that show the opposition between these two kind of able and able are, for example, the example like preferable and preferable, comparable or comparable. Phonologically, the stem in the first is stressed differently in combination with able than it is in isolation. Compare, for example, the pronunciation of prefer. This is typical of primary affix, and in addition, the semantics of the form containing the primary affix able are less direct or less compositional than the semantics of the forms containing the second affix able. If two models are not comparable, they are unlike. If they are not compatible, it is not possible in a literal sense to compare them. The semantics of forms containing the secondary affix able are so predictable that they are often not even listed in dictionary. So looking at other able and able pairs, again, we discover other phonological characteristics of primary affixation. Consider, for example, these words, the following words. The first, a primary affix able, defensible, defendable, perceptible, perceivable, divisible, dividable. You see here again there are another differences between these two kind of affixes. Forms with this able, this example, exhibit allomorphy in the stem, defense. You see, they use a form that is recognizable from nouns, namely defense, perception, and division, instead of the citation form of the lexeme defend, perceive, and divide. The fact that able can be spelled able is unimportant here. Further examples of stem allomorphs occurring with the primary affix able are given in the leftmost column in this example again. Cultivate, the base form is cultive, and the secondary affix able cultivatable. The base form is cultivate, you see. Educable, educatable, educate. You see here, and the other examples. For example, navigable, navigatable, navigate. So the second pair of columns in this example show that the secondary affix able differs from able in, the primary affix able in attaching to the citation form of the lexeme. Cultivate, educate, navigate. You see, another difference between primary able and secondary able is that in words of the form, X plus secondary able, X must be a transitive verb. In example, the above example, cultivate, educate, navigate, you see, are all transitive. But the first affix able, on the other hand, is sometimes found on stems that are not transitive verb, such as pos, for example, possible, or risible. You see, we have said that we would de-emphasize etymology in our discussion of primary and secondary affixes, but here it becomes important. So this is another difference between these two kind of affixes. Many words with primary affixes, including possible and risible, were borrowed directly into English from French or Latin. They are fossilized. Speakers have learned to use them, not created them on their own. However, even such a fossilized example as possible and risible are significant because they illustrate another point. Speakers are able to isolate both primary and secondary affixes when presented with words that contain them. Possible may be stored in the lexicon as a whole, but it is nevertheless analyzable. A person such as a child or a second language learner encountering possible for the first time will recognize it as an adjective because it ends in able. In talking about the distinction between primary and secondary affixes, we have focused on suffixes, okay? We talked just about the suffixes until now, I mean, about the differences between primary affixes and secondary affixes, but you see that prefixes can be primary or secondary as well. An example of a primary prefix is in, you see in this example, and an example of a secondary one is on. Both mean not. Phonologically, in has allomorphs. You see, it surfaces as, for example, ir, im, in, and ill. A word like irregulable, inviolable, imperceptible, indivisible, you see here. But on does not have any allomorphs, as you see here. On is of Germanic origin with cognates in early stages of English, in contrast to in, which came to English from Latin through French. So in, like able, I mean the primary suffix able, attached to the allomorphic stem, you see, irregulable, inviolable, imperceptible, indivisible. The stems it attached to are stressed differently than the lexical stem of the corresponding lexemes. You see again, irreparable, unrepairable, irrevocable, unrevocable. You see here again, in may attach to non-lexical stems, while on does not. In attached to lexical stem as well. Again, impossible, for example. Look at this example, inept, but we cannot use unept because ept is not a lexical stem, so just we use it with the n as a primary prefix, not the secondary prefix. Inert, but not on earth, because earth is not a lexical stem. Again, you see there are some differences between primary prefix and secondary prefixes. So compare well-formed words, prefixes with on, such as ungodly, unlike, unsteady, for example. These words, for example, godly and steady, are all lexical stems. An exception to this general observation is unkempt. There is no lexical stem kempt, so this is exceptional form. Another difference, on, as a secondary prefix, is also more productive than in as a first, the first, prefix. You can test this claim yourself by thinking of some adjectives that do not usually have an in or on prefix form. So we have, for example, do we have in wet or on wet, in dead or on dead? So if you are observant, you have noticed a final and very important difference between in and on. The former, in, has a special relationship with able, as the first, suffix, and the latter with able, the secondary suffix. Words with able, the primary suffix, are prefixed with in and not with on, while words with able as a secondary suffix are prefixed with on. We have included our discussion of primary and secondary affixes in a chapter that deals with the interaction between phonology and morphology, because that is the context in which this distinction has most often been treated, and because it led to important work in phonology. Our objective was not to give a comprehensive account of the topic, but rather an overview, and thus we have left many issues untouched. So, under the heading Lexical Phonology, phonologists have used the distinction between the two types of affixes to explore the possibility that different phonological rules apply at different levels of morphological derivation. But as we have seen, primary and secondary affixes have semantic consequences as well. In particular, the semantics of primary affixes is less likely to be fully compositional, and this is another difference between the primary affixes and the secondary affixes, I mean the suffix or the prefix. So these are the differences between primary affixes and the secondary affixes, including suffixes and prefixes, which we put, I mean, the summary of these differences in this box. As you see here, primary and secondary affixes in English, the summary: primary, often of Latin Romance origin, but secondary, often of Germanic origin. The primary affixes cause a stress shift, but the secondary affix do not cause a stress shift. The primary affix usually occur closer to the stem than secondary affixes, and the secondary affix usually occur outside of primary affixes. The primary affix, about the primary affix, the semantics of the derived form tend to be less compositional, but in the secondary affix, the semantics of the derived form tend to be compositional. And the primary affix may attach to a non-basic allomorph of the stem, but the secondary affix attach to a stem's basic allomorph. And the other difference, the primary affix, the affix itself may have allomorphs, but here the affix itself does not have allomorphs. And the last one, the primary affix may attach to non-lexical stems, but the secondary affixes attach to lexical stems, words from lexical category like noun, verb, adjective, and adverb. As you see, these are the summary of the differences between primary and secondary affixes. And if I ask you about these kind of differences, you should talk about these kind of differences with example from English or some other languages like Arabic languages. So in this, the chapter and this session, I talked about the third approaches to morphology, reduplication, which we use this kind of approach and pattern in some languages. For example, like the example which I talk about it. Then at the end of this session, at last part, I talked about the primary and secondary affixes, the definition of the affixes, including prefixes and suffixes, which we have two kind of affixes, primary and secondary. Each of them has its kind of a special kind of properties, and you see there are some differences between these two kind of affixes about the stress shift, the allomorphy, and some of the differences. And I said that the affixes including suffixes and prefixes, so there are some again differences between primary prefixes and the secondary suffixes. And as you see at last in this box, I talked about the summary of the differences between primary affixes and secondary affixes, as I told you, including suffixes and prefixes, which is about the origin, the stress shift, the stem, the allomorphy, and some other differences which I talk about these phenomena. So in the next chapter, I will talk about some other approaches related to morphology, and we can end the chapter 3, the relationship between phonology and the morphology. Okay, I think that's enough for today. Thank you for your attention, and goodbye everybody.